Tonight, we uncover the hidden world of the Watchers, a secret order whose experiments were so advanced, so forbidden, that the Church did not merely silence them, they erased them. From monasteries to cathedrals, from glowing relics to coded star charts, their work spanned medicine, astronomy, mechanics, and alchemy, a knowledge so powerful it threatened the very control of time and faith. Every lens, every manuscript, every carefully measured stone was a piece of a puzzle the world was never meant to see. Those who sought to preserve it hid in plain sight, disguised as priests, midwives, masons, and travellers, passing wisdom through songs, architecture, and whispered formulas. And those who tried to expose it? They vanished into silence, their discoveries buried beneath stone, fire, and doctrine. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because what you are about to see may change everything you thought you knew about history, knowledge, and the power that shapes both. There are pages that change everything, not because of what they say, but because of what someone tried so hard to erase. In the archives of an old monastery on the edge of the Alps, a single torn folio was found sealed behind the wall of a collapsed scriptorium. Its ink had faded, its edges burned, yet the words that remained were enough to ignite the imagination of every historian who dared to read them. They spoke of an order known only as the Watchers, and of experiments performed not for power or gold, but for what the writer called the healing of nations. No one had ever heard of this order before. It appeared in no official records, no papal letters, no histories. It existed only on this fragment that should not have survived. The page was dated around the 9th century, the very heart of what we call the Dark Ages. But there was something even stranger. The handwriting and the ink style did not match that period. It was as if the page had been written centuries later, then forced backward into history, hidden among older texts to appear ancient. The question that followed was inevitable. Who wrote it, and why did they want it to be found so much later? When scholars tried to trace the origin of the parchment, they discovered the monastery had once belonged to an order accused of heresy in the 13th century. Its library was confiscated, its members scattered or executed, yet one wall in the north wing had been sealed during the purge. It was there that the folio was found, centuries later, untouched by fire or decay, as if it had been waiting. The words that survived described experiments involving light, sound, and human thought. It mentioned patterns of energy measured in circles, mirrors made of polished stone, and prayers designed to resonate like waves. Some believed it described early attempts at science. Others whispered it spoke of something far more mysterious, something that blurred the line between faith and technology. The name The Watchers sent a shiver through even the most skeptical minds. That same name appears in apocryphal writings, describing ancient beings who once taught forbidden knowledge to mankind. Could the monks, who called themselves Watchers, have believed they were continuing that legacy? And if so, what knowledge had they uncovered that the Church was so desperate to bury? Soon after the discovery, the folio vanished from the public archive. The official statement claimed it was transferred for restoration, but the restoration lab never received it. The wall where it was found was resealed. No photos were released, no rubbings, no copies. It was as if the page had never existed. Yet rumours spread that before it disappeared, a student had transcribed a few lines. They describe an experiment called the awakening of matter, something involving sound and light interacting with living tissue. The handwriting stops mid-sentence as if interrupted. From that moment, the folio's existence became a secret, whispered only among archivists. What if this page was not a myth? What if the Dark Ages were never dark at all? What if the light of knowledge was simply hidden, sealed away by those who feared what it could reveal? Perhaps the greatest experiment the Watchers ever conducted was not in stone or ink, but in silence itself. The name appeared first as a whisper, tucked between the margins of forgotten manuscripts, Then, as a rumour carried by monks who copied ancient texts by candlelight, the Watchers. A title that sounded more like myth than memory. Some said it came from the Book of Enoch, a text the Church tried to bury long before the Middle Ages. In that story, the Watchers were angels who descended to earth, drawn by curiosity for humankind. They taught forbidden arts, the crafting of metals, the reading of stars, the mixing of medicines, and for that they were cast down. To those who read this in secret monasteries centuries later, the name carried both danger and fascination. To be a Watcher was to seek knowledge beyond permission. It was both a curse and a calling. In cloisters across Europe, the name began to resurface around the 10th century, not in official records, but in quiet conversations, in notes slipped between pages, in confessions whispered under oaths of silence. There were monks who spoke of a circle of brothers who refused to let ancient knowledge die after Rome fell. They gathered texts, experimented with instruments, and recorded their findings in ciphered Latin. They called themselves the Watchers, borrowing the name not to imitate angels, but to remember what it meant to see when others were told to close their eyes. The name travelled from abbey to abbey like a ghost. Each generation added new layers to its meaning. In some places, it described engineers who built strange devices of water and gears to mark the hours of prayer. In others, it meant astronomers who charted the sky in defiance of church decrees. But in the Vatican's secret records, it began to appear with a different tone. There, the Watchers were not scholars but threats. The earliest Vatican mention appears in a disciplinary letter dated around the year 1070. It warns of a group of clerics in northern Italy who engaged in observations of the heavens and in the preparation of instruments unsanctioned by faith. The letter orders their works to be confiscated, their names struck from the rolls. From that moment on, the Watchers vanish from formal history, yet their legend continued underground. Later, monastic gossip claimed that the Watchers used a secret symbol, an open eye carved within a circle, often hidden in church, stonework, or illuminated manuscripts. Some even said their gatherings took place at midnight, not to pray, but to test what they called the harmony of creation. The name evolved, slipping from Latin into the tongues of common people. In French, they were les veillants, in German die Wächter, in English simply the Watchers. Each translation carried the same pulse of mystery, the same defiance of silence. Whether they were angels, heretics, or early scientists, no one could say for sure. But what frightened the church most was not what they knew. It was what the name itself inspired. To watch was to awaken. To awaken was to question. And once a person begins to question, no power, no doctrine, no wall of stone can fully contain them. Across the ruins of old monasteries, there are traces of something that should not have existed. Rooms too small to be chapels, too structured to be cells, with scorched floors and narrow vents carved into the stone. They appear again and again in the ledgers of early abbeys, listed under a strange Latin term, laboratorium. At first glance, it looks like a simple workshop, a place for making candles or storing wine. But the surviving inventories tell another story. They mention glass retorts, copper crucibles, magnet stones, and devices of articulated brass. Objects that belong to experiment, not devotion. For a time, these laboratories were openly maintained by the Church. Some even received funding from local bishops who saw them as tools for studying God's creation. But then, somewhere between the years 1000 and 1100, the references vanish. Later copies of the same ledgers remove the term entirely, replacing it with generic entries like storage room or tool house. It was as if a whole network of medieval research centres had been erased from history. In one surviving copy of the Abbey of Street Gall's ledger, a monk's note in the margin reads simply, "Destroyed for purity." What did purity have to fear from glass and flame? There are letters from travelling scholars that speak of monks in distant mountain abbeys who could melt metals with mirrors, who understood the pull of lodestones, who built mechanical birds that sang when the wind passed through them. The Church tolerated these wonders for a time, calling them instruments of faith. But when curiosity began to drift from theology to the physical world, tolerance turned to fear. A single rumour of heresy could undo a lifetime of study. Those who dared to build, to measure, to question, were quietly reassigned or erased. Some of the laboratories were sealed by stone, others were converted into wine cellars or prayer rooms. The few devices that survived were labelled relics, their true purpose forgotten. In a monastery near Lyon, archaeologists found fragments of a brass sphere that once rotated on an axle. Engraved on its surface were zodiac signs and Latin phrases linking the motion of the heavens to the rhythm of the human pulse. It was dismantled sometime around the year 1110 after a papal decree banned the construction of astronomical instruments. Only the base remained, blackened by fire. Each discovery adds to a growing suspicion that Europe once possessed a chain of scientific centres, centuries before the Renaissance, hidden in plain sight under the robe of faith. And when the Church decided to reclaim control over knowledge, it was not enough to stop new experiments. The memory of the old ones had to be buried as well. The term laboratorium disappeared from Latin altogether, replaced by the safer word officina. But in a handful of secret manuscripts, the Watchers continued to use the old term. To them, a laboratory was not a room. It was a promise that truth could be tested, that even within the walls of silence, the spark of understanding could survive. Along the shifting borders of medieval Europe, far from the marble halls of Rome, there lived a different kind of monk. They called themselves keepers of the boundary, brothers who walked between two worlds. Their monasteries stood at the edges of kingdoms, in forests where pagan rituals still lingered, on cliffs where ancient stone circles looked down upon the sea. These monks lived among people who still remembered the old gods, who studied the sky without fear, who healed with herbs and whispers. Instead of erasing those traditions, the monks listened. They watched. They learned. Then they wrote everything down in Latin, hidden within the margins of prayer books and psalters. To the casual eye, their notes looked like simple commentary. But to those who knew the code, they were a map of forgotten wisdom. These were the monks of the boundary. One of the earliest records of their existence comes from a monastery near the Pyrenees, around the year 970. There, a scribe named Brother Albinus filled the sides of his Bible with tiny symbols that resembled constellations. When studied under candlelight, the markings formed a complete star chart, aligned with the equinoxes, centuries before official European astronomy would rediscover such precision. In Ireland, border monks copied herbal recipes from Druid healers, translating them into Latin phrases wrapped in theology. A line that read about the body of Christ could hide a description of willow bark used to stop fever. In the Alps, others recorded the properties of stones that glowed faintly under fire, minerals later known to contain phosphorus. They called it the breath of angels. To survive, these monks practiced a delicate art. They had to appear devout while protecting ideas the Church considered dangerous. They attended Mass, recited psalms, and copied scripture by day, but by night they gathered local stories about the moon and the weather, the tides and the stars. They understood that truth did not belong to one faith. It was a thread connecting all traditions. Their Latin was filled with deliberate double meanings. When they wrote of divine light, it could mean sunlight refracted through glass. When they spoke of heavenly harmony, it could describe the measured intervals of sound waves. Their language was a shield. It allowed them to pass forbidden knowledge right under the eyes of authority, but secrecy came at a cost. When the Inquisition began spreading across Europe in the 12th century, border monks were among the first to vanish. Whole monasteries were emptied, their books were burned or rewritten. Yet traces of their work survive in strange places, in medical manuscripts from Italy, in agricultural manuals from France, in hymn books that describe lunar rhythms. They carried the knowledge of two worlds and paid for it with anonymity. They were not rebels, they were bridges. And in every note, every symbol, every hidden sentence, they left behind a quiet reminder. Truth does not vanish at the border. It waits for those brave enough to cross. There are churches in Europe where stone saints once moved, where wooden angels lifted their wings, and where walls seemed to whisper when no one stood near. To a worshipper in the 12th century, these sites were miracles. But to those who built them, they were something more astonishing. They were machines. Hidden behind altars and choir stalls, networks of gears, pulleys, and water channels brought sacred images to life. Bells rang with no human hand. Candles flickered at the exact moment a prayer ended. Statues turned their heads as if listening to the faithful. The builders called them engines of prayer, devices meant to inspire awe and devotion. But the closer you look, the more it becomes clear that these were not mere props. They were experiments, demonstrations of a science that the Church could not fully explain. The earliest record of such devices appears in a monastic chronicle from the year 1040, describing an abbot who designed a clock that released birds made of brass each hour. Their wings were powered by steam rising from a hidden cistern. In Constantinople, a Byzantine engineer built a throne that could lift a bishop high above the congregation using water pressure alone. These inventions fascinated the faithful, but unsettled the theologians. If a statue could move by hidden means, what separated a miracle from a mechanism? The Watchers saw opportunity where others saw danger. To them, every machine was a form of worship, a way to uncover the logic woven into creation itself. They studied the principles behind these automata, refining them in secret workshops. Some even adapted the designs to study airflow, sound, and rhythm, claiming that prayer and physics were two languages speaking of the same truth. In a forgotten abbey in southern France, archaeologists discovered fragments of copper tubing beneath a collapsed chapel floor. The layout suggested a system that could carry whispers from one end of the hall to the other, allowing a single voice to sound like a chorus. Imagine standing in a candlelit church, hearing a voice echo from nowhere, and believing it to be divine. The Watchers used such illusions to explore the nature of sound and perception, questions that modern science would not ask again for centuries. Yet these wonders drew suspicion. The Church began labeling such works as mechanical sorcery, accusing their creators of blasphemy for imitating the divine. Many engines of prayer were dismantled, their builders silenced. By the late 13th century, the art of sacred mechanics had all but vanished. Still, scattered reports speak of chapels where the air hummed with hidden machinery long after their creators were gone. To this day, some cathedrals hold carvings of gears and cogs tucked into stone borders, as if the builders left behind a quiet signature. Perhaps they wanted future generations to know that faith and invention once shared the same breath. That even in an age ruled by silence, there were those who dared to make the stones themselves sing. There are cathedrals where sound does not simply echo, it breathes. A single note sung by a choir can linger for nearly 10 seconds, twisting through the vaults before fading like a ghost. The people of the Middle Ages called it divine resonance, a gift from heaven that made stone speak. But recent studies and hidden manuscripts suggest that this was no accident, it was design. The Watchers, those silent architects of mystery, understood something few dared to say aloud. They knew that sound could shape emotion, and that emotion could shape belief. They turned their cathedrals into living instruments. Every wall, every arch, every curve of stained glass was tuned like the strings of a vast harp built for God. In a surviving letter from the year 1208, a monk named Brother Adrian describes testing echoes by clapping his hands under unfinished vaults, marking the spots where sound returned strongest. He called these places the breathing points of the church. The watchers later mapped them, recording resonance nodes as if charting constellations in air. When choirs sang the ancient chants, their voices struck those invisible points and multiplied. The sound did not just fill the room, it entered the body, vibrating in bone and blood. Worshippers described feeling lifted, weightless, as if the music opened a gate to another world. To ordinary believers, this was the hand of God. To the watchers, it was proof that sacred geometry and acoustics were one and the same. They discovered that slight changes in the shape of an arch or the angle of a column could alter the mood of those who listened. Sharper angles brought tension and awe. Wider vaults created warmth and peace. By the time the Gothic age reached its height in the 13th century, these builders had mastered the secret symphony of stone. They even encoded their findings into music itself. Certain chants carried sonic keys, hidden frequencies that resonated perfectly with the cathedrals that held them. When sung at the right pitch, the entire structure would seem to hum in reply. Some believe this was the origin of the legend that angels sang in the rafters. The truth may have been closer to physics than miracle, yet for the church, such knowledge bordered on danger. To admit that emotion could be engineered meant admitting that spiritual experience could be controlled. The watchers continued their work quietly, recording ratios, scales, and frequencies in coded manuscripts disguised as hymns. When inquisitors later searched monasteries for heresy, many of these musical scores were destroyed, their margins scraped clean. But the sound remained. Even today, when a choir sings in Chartres or Notre Dame, the same invisible currents rise and fall. You can still feel the hum of those hidden architects, those watchers who once turned faith into sound and silence into science. They made the cathedrals sing, and in doing so, they taught stone how to remember. It began with strange markings hidden in the corners of old manuscripts. At first they looked like decoration, small spirals, and intersecting lines that meant nothing. But when compared across libraries from France to Armenia, the same symbols began to appear again and again, as if left by a single, unseen hand. Scholars who studied them later called it the forbidden alphabet. Those who used it had another name. They called it the angelic script. The earliest record of this alphabet dates to the year 1093, found in a weathered psalter stored in the monastery of Montserrat. Each symbol corresponded not to letters, but to movements of stars and measurements of time. When arranged in sequence, the script became something like an equation disguised as writing. The watchers, always a step ahead of their age, were believed to have designed it as a code to store knowledge across languages. Within its grammar, astronomy, music, and mathematics merged into one. A single word could represent both a sound and a number, a constellation and a verse. To the untrained eye, it was divine gibberish. To those who understood, it was a portable machine for thought. The Church noticed the symbols appearing in margins of sacred texts and reacted with fear. In the year 1142, a decree was issued forbidding the use of unknown alphabets in religious writings. Yet the script persisted, travelling quietly through manuscripts copied by sympathetic monks. Some claimed it had the power to reveal hidden harmonies in scripture. Others whispered it was a celestial language, older than Latin, spoken by angels before the fall of man. Whatever its origin, its structure was too advanced for its time. It used positional logic similar to binary, 1,000 years before modern computation. The watchers may have discovered a way to encode data long before the idea of machines existed. In one recovered fragment, the phrase lumen caelum translates loosely as light of the heavens. But when the symbols are rearranged by their numerical values, they match the coordinates of major stars visible in the winter sky. Each word was a map, each line a key. This blending of sacred and scientific language alarmed those in power. If knowledge could be hidden inside scripture, then any monk might possess secrets the Vatican itself could not control. By the 13th century, possession of angelic script was grounds for interrogation. Many manuscripts were confiscated and locked away. Some were burned, others quietly absorbed into new texts, their symbols redrawn as harmless ornament, but pieces survived. A handful of copies resurfaced in the 16th century, influencing alchemists and early linguists who mistook them for magical runes. Even today, a few symbols remain carved into cathedral stones, waiting to be read again. Perhaps the forbidden alphabet was never meant to be divine or heretical. Perhaps it was a bridge between the visible and the hidden, proof that the Watchers believed truth should not be spoken in one language alone. It should be written in all of them at once. Long before telescopes were built, the Watchers were already studying the heavens with precision that would not be matched for centuries. They called their charts the sky ladders, a name that came from the idea that each star was a rung leading from earth to the mind of God. In quiet monasteries, far from the noise of cities, monks climbed rooftops at night, marking the movements of the planets with ink and patience. They recorded every phase of the moon, every shift in brightness, every wandering path of the stars. Over time, their journals revealed patterns. Jupiter rose in the same part of the sky every 12 years. Eclipses followed a rhythm that could be predicted. The heavens were not random, they were ordered, like music written in light. By the year 1120, these records had grown into vast logs of observation. The Watchers began comparing celestial cycles to events on Earth. They noticed crops flourished when planted under certain alignments. Surgeries healed faster when performed on specific days of the lunar month. Travelers who followed star charts avoided storms that others could not foresee. To them, this was evidence that the sky and earth were woven together, part of one living system. They tested their theories carefully, recording success and failure with the same devotion as prayer. The Church did not see it that way. To theologians, such work bordered on blasphemy. If human lives could be influenced by the stars, then free will, the cornerstone of faith, was under threat. A monk who could predict the outcome of a harvest or a war seemed to challenge divine authority. By the year 1200, several Watchers were accused of practicing astrology, a crime that blurred the line between science and sorcery. One letter from a bishop in Florence describes a group of monks who were forced to destroy their star tables under the eyes of the Inquisition. The parchment was burned, but their knowledge was not. Fragments of the sky ladders survived, passed from teacher to student, hidden in coded margins, or carved into the ceilings of cloisters disguised as decoration. A star here, a line there, a pattern only the initiated could see. In some monasteries, chants were written to match planetary cycles, sung at exact intervals, so that time itself became part of the experiment. The Watchers believed that understanding the stars was not an act of rebellion, but of reverence. To study creation was to study the Creator. But the more accurate their predictions became, the more dangerous they grew. For the Church, chance was faith's ally. Predictability was its enemy. And so, one by one, the sky ladders were dismantled. Yet, even today, if you stand beneath the night sky and trace the same constellations they once followed, you will feel their presence. Those silent astronomers, punished for watching too closely, left behind more than charts. They left a message written in the stars themselves. Knowledge, like light, always finds a way back to Earth. In the quiet stone rooms of medieval monasteries, where prayer and pain met side by side, something remarkable took place. Behind the doors of infirmaries meant for tending the sick, the Watchers turned healing into a science long before that word existed. They wrote in careful Latin about blood, balsam, and breath. To most of Europe, recovery was a miracle, the result of divine mercy. But in the hidden notes of these monks, miracles became methods. One parchment found in an abbey near Canterbury, dated around the year 1140, describes washing wounds with boiled wine to prevent rot. Another mentions the stitching of cuts, with threads soaked in resin and honey to seal the skin. These were not prayers, they were procedures. The Watchers kept their discoveries coded within devotional texts, describing them as acts of penance or metaphors for the soul's cleansing. To heal the body was to heal sin, they wrote, but their tone was that of experimenters, not priests. They tested, observed, compared. In the monasteries of southern Italy, where knowledge from the Islamic world flowed quietly across the sea, monks learned to use herbs like myrrh and juniper as antiseptics. They mixed crushed bark with olive oil to treat burns, and used steam from boiling herbs to ease breathing in those dying of fever. Some of their notes even describe forms of controlled breathing and meditation that calmed patients before surgery. They called it the rhythm of creation, a cycle of inhaling and releasing that mirrored the movement of tides. The Church viewed these practices with suspicion. Healing was meant to be a matter of faith, not of formula. To claim that wounds closed faster because of a salve, or that fever could be reduced by controlled breathing, bordered on heresy. Yet, the Watchers persisted. They saw the body as a sacred instrument, one that could be tuned just as the cathedrals were tuned for sound. They believed that breath carried not only air, but memory, that every inhale connected man to the same force that moved the stars. When a patient recovered, the monks recorded the result, but in public they called it a miracle. In private, they compared notes and refined their methods. Over time, their writings were gathered into bound manuscripts, labelled only with single words, like mercy or salvation. Many were later reclassified by church scribes as devotional works and placed under restricted access. It was a subtle way to bury truth without burning it. By the late 13th century, open medical experimentation in monasteries had vanished. The remaining infirmaries returned to prayer and anointing oils blessed by priests. Still, hidden between psalms and litanies, the Watchers' formulas endured. They survived in whispers, in folk remedies, in the hands of midwives and healers who never learned where their knowledge began. Perhaps it was not divine intervention that saved so many lives during the Dark Ages, but the quiet persistence of those who dared to turn faith into method. They healed in secret and left behind proof that even in silence, the human mind was learning how to cure itself. Beneath one of the oldest monasteries in northern Spain, there lies a chamber with no windows. Its walls are bare stone, its ceiling curved like the inside of a shell. According to legend, this was once called the Map Room. It was here that the Watchers gathered the world, not through travel, but through whispers. Traders arriving from distant ports, mariners returning from forbidden seas, even wandering scholars brought fragments of what they had seen. The monks listened, recorded, compared. Then they stitched the fragments together into maps unlike anything Europe was supposed to know. On these maps, the coast of Africa curved smoothly past the equator, long before any European ship had sailed that far. The southern tip of South America appeared not as a rumour, but as a precise outline. Some even showed a vast frozen land at the bottom of the world, drawn centuries before Antarctica was found. To the Watchers, mapping was a sacred act. To chart the earth was to reveal the pattern of creation. But to the Church, it was dangerous. The official world ended where Scripture said it should. Anything beyond was heresy. Around the year 1210, an abbot named Renatus compiled a massive composite chart using reports from Arab navigators and Genoese captains. It depicted islands and coasts unknown to the papal geographers. When his map reached Rome, he was ordered to destroy it. Instead, he sealed it in the map room and carved a Latin phrase above the door, Terra de multa est, the lands of God are many. After his death, the door was walled over and the room forgotten. Centuries later, fragments of these forbidden maps began reappearing in later works. The famous Piri Reis map of 1513 bears striking resemblance to sketches attributed to Renatus's circle. The same shorelines, the same odd accuracy. Scholars now believe that the Watchers' composite charts survived secretly, passed between orders of monks who continued to refine them long after official exploration began. But when those same regions were rediscovered centuries later, the charts were redrawn to match doctrine, continents were renamed, boundaries were rewritten. Knowledge that came from pagans or unbelievers was erased. The Church's world had to remain perfect, symmetrical, and blessed. A curved earth had to fit inside a flat theology. The Watcher's map room, if it still exists, would hold proof that medieval Europe knew far more than it was allowed to say. Some believe the chamber lies beneath the Vatican itself, its shelves still lined with rolled parchments, labelled with numbers instead of names. Others think the maps were cut apart, their pieces bound into atlases, now sitting on display in plain sight, stripped of their heretical context. Either way, one truth remains. Every map tells two stories. The one that is shown to the world, and the one hidden beneath the ink. The Watchers understood that the shape of the earth could change faith itself, and so they drew the world as it was, not as they were told it should be. There was a time when knowledge could be burned. A single fire in a monastery could erase generations of thought. The Watchers knew this better than anyone. To protect what they learned, they built a new kind of library, one that could not be touched by flame or seized by authority. They called it the Memory Forge. It was not made of stone or paper, but of the human mind itself. In the 12th century, certain monasteries began teaching a strange discipline that blended geometry, meditation, and imagery. The monks would walk labyrinths carved into the floor of cloisters, memorizing every turn and pattern. Each path represented a subject, each corner a symbol. As they walked, they recited prayers mixed with coded facts, binding information to rhythm and motion. Over time, the body itself became the book. This technique spread quietly from monasteries to guilds, from priests to builders, from scholars to traders who carried news across borders. A stonemason in France could recall mathematical ratios by tracing them with his steps around a cathedral column. A healer in Florence could remember the properties of herbs by linking each to a colour or a saint's image. To outsiders, it looked like devotion. In truth, it was encrypted learning. When armies looted abbeys and burned libraries, the Watchers' knowledge survived, hidden in memory palaces built inside human thought. The practice may have roots in older pagan methods of oral tradition, but the Watchers refined it into something far more complex. They used sacred geometry as a framework, combining circles, triangles, and squares as mental coordinates. A series of icons might encode entire treatises on anatomy or astronomy. To recall a fact, one simply walked through the imagined architecture of the mind, opening each door in sequence. The Church, at first, encouraged these exercises as tools for contemplation. But when inquisitors noticed that some monks could quote texts that had been officially banned, suspicion grew. By the year 1290, the Vatican declared certain forms of visualization to be spiritually dangerous. Monks who continued the practice risked accusation of heresy, yet the method could not be stopped. It required no tools, no books, only discipline and silence. The Watchers used it to pass forbidden knowledge across continents. When two of them met in secret, they could exchange years of learning through a single conversation filled with symbols and metaphors. A gesture, a phrase, even a shared hymn could unlock entire volumes of memory. In this way, knowledge became invisible, untraceable, immortal. Many of the labyrinths still carved into the stone floors of Europe are not decorations. They are diagrams of thought, reminders of the path within. The Memory Forge proved that even when every book was seized, wisdom could not be chained. The mind, once awakened, became the true sanctuary, a vault no power could ever burn. In the dim vaults of medieval cathedrals, there were objects that seemed alive, bones that glowed faintly in darkness, fragments of cloth that shimmered like embers, and paintings whose colours deepened when candles were lit. To the faithful, these were miracles, proof that heaven touched matter. To the watchers, they were questions. What made a relic shine? Why did certain pigments respond to heat or light? Could holiness be measured, reproduced, even understood? In the 12th century, whispers spread of a group of monks testing relics in secret. They compared their brightness under different kinds of flame, noting how oil, wax, and tallow changed the effect. They discovered that many relics had been treated with crushed minerals, like calcite or ground shells, mixed with animal fat, substances known now to create phosphorescence. When heated by candles or body warmth, they glowed softly. What began as reverence turned into inquiry. The watchers debated whether such reactions were divine or natural, and if understanding them diminished their mystery or revealed a greater truth. In a cloister near Prague, one brother recorded his experiments in a small journal dated the year 1208. He described mixing powdered stone from an old altar with honey and vinegar to produce a glowing paste. When applied to parchment, it left invisible markings that appeared only when warmed by breath. He called it scriptum spiritus, the writing of the spirit. Later, similar inks appeared in manuscripts linked to the watchers, their secret notes visible only under heat or candlelight. To outsiders, the idea of testing relics was unthinkable. Relics were not to be studied, only venerated, yet the monks could not ignore what they saw. Some relics glowed because of chemicals in the materials, others because of the oils and salts from centuries of human touch. Still others, they believed, because of natural preservation. Fragments of bone and hair, found sealed in glass, were remarkably intact, treated with resins that delayed decay. The watchers recorded their findings carefully, disguising their notes as prayers. They wrote that light is the breath of matter, and that sanctity is not above the laws of creation, but within them. Such language allowed their discoveries to survive hidden inside devotion. But as their work spread, fear followed. Church authorities began to question why certain relics lost their glow when moved from one cathedral to another. A few priests quietly admitted that relics were sometimes painted with special pigments to appear radiant in processions. When this truth reached Rome, an order was issued forbidding tampering with sacred objects. Publicly, the decree was about preserving holiness. Privately, it was about control. The watchers withdrew deeper into secrecy, still fascinated by the thin line between miracle and mechanism. For them, the glow of relics was not a trick of faith, but a glimpse into a larger design, one where the laws of nature and the mysteries of belief were the same language spoken through light. In the winter of the year 1291, a strange device was built in a monastery near Lyon. It was a clock, though not like any other. Its gears were carved from brass, its face engraved with symbols of the zodiac, and at its centre was a dial that tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and known planets. The monks who built it called it the computus, a machine to calculate the proper dates of holy feasts. But the watchers who designed it had another purpose. They wanted to see if the sacred calendar aligned with the stars. For centuries, the Church had fixed its holy days according to decrees that ignored the slow drift of the heavens. The computers changed that. It followed an older stellar calendar, one inherited from Egyptian and Babylonian sources, measuring time by the true motion of the sky. When the device was finished, it began to reveal something unsettling. According to the stars, the dates of major feasts no longer matched the seasons as they once had. Easter, the celebration tied to both spring and resurrection, fell further and further from the equinox. The heavens themselves disagreed with the Church. At first, the monks thought it was an error in the mechanism. They adjusted the weights, recalibrated the gears, even rebuilt the central dial. But the pattern remained. The stars did not lie. When word of the computus reached higher authorities, a delegation of theologians was sent to investigate. They arrived quietly, spent days in the clock chamber, and left without speaking to anyone. Weeks later, an order arrived from Rome. The machine was to be dismantled, its creators reassigned to distant monasteries. Officially, the computus had failed to measure time correctly. Unofficially, it had measured it too well. The watchers recorded the event as the daytime stopped. The clock that could align heaven and earth had been silenced. Some fragments of the device were saved. A single gear, engraved with a Latin phrase, tempus est mensura animae, time is the measure of the soul, was hidden inside a prayer book. Centuries later, when mechanical clocks spread across Europe, many used designs suspiciously similar to the lost computus. Its influence had survived in secret. The story of the clock became a parable whispered among scholars. It warned that knowledge which contradicts power is often buried, not because it is wrong, but because it reveals too much. The watchers understood that whoever controls the measurement of time controls history itself. The computus had shown that calendars could drift, that the official counting of years could be shaped to fit doctrine. When it was destroyed, the Church's version of time became the only one left. Yet the stars continued their quiet movement, faithful to no decree. And somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten vault or buried under centuries of dust, the remains of that first forbidden clock still mark a moment when humanity almost rediscovered how to keep time with the universe itself. By the middle of the 13th century, fear had become a ceremony. In cities from Paris to Florence, crowds gathered not to watch criminals punished, but to see books burn. The fire court, as it came to be called, was not a courtroom, but a ritual. Monks in dark robes read lists of forbidden titles, while flames rose in the public square. The smoke carried the scent of ink and parchment, the silent end of ideas that had taken lifetimes to write. At first, only obvious heresies were condemned, texts that questioned the nature of Christ or the authority of Rome. But the list grew longer with each passing decade. Soon, even treatises on stars, magnets, and lenses were declared suspect. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the catalogue of forbidden books, became thicker than any Bible. The watchers understood what this meant. The war for the soul had shifted into a war for the mind. In one surviving letter from the year 1287, a friar in Avignon wrote, "They burn the paper now, for the paper cannot scream." He described an order from the Vatican instructing confessors to question parishioners not only about sins of flesh or faith, but about objects of curiosity. Did they own any glass that bent light? Had they seen symbols carved into stones? Did they sing songs whose melodies did not appear in hymnals? The Church feared not just ideas but tools. A lens could magnify the unseen. A magnet could move without touch. A song in a forbidden scale could stir thoughts that prayers could not control. The fire court made examples of anyone who possessed such things. In one documented case from the city of Cologne, a group of monks were accused of crafting lenses that could read hidden writing. They were spared execution, but their instruments were smashed and their books burned. To the crowd, it was purification. To the watchers, it was amputation, the cutting away of knowledge from the human body. Yet the more the flames consumed, the more determined the watchers became. They began writing in code, disguising treatises as psalms or sermons. The geometry of cathedral arches hid equations. The lyrics of hymns concealed astronomical cycles. They buried magnets inside reliquaries and lenses behind icons so that their work could survive in plain sight. The fire court could destroy parchment, but not intention. In time, inquisitors realized that the same symbols they had tried to erase were reappearing in new manuscripts copied within their own monasteries. They began to understand that the Watchers were not a sect to be eliminated, but a current flowing beneath the surface of faith itself. The flames that were meant to end heresy had only scattered its embers, and so the burning continued, not because it worked, but because it was the only way left to make the world believe that light came only from fire. When the fires of censorship spread across Europe, the Watchers learned that survival depended on invisibility. Their books could be seized, their workshops destroyed, their names erased, but their knowledge could still travel, hidden in the hands of those no one would ever suspect. So they built a network of couriers in plain sight. Lay brotherhoods, midwives, and stonemasons became the silent arteries of their secret world. Each carried fragments of forbidden learning disguised as ordinary trade. A mason's ledger, listing stone weights and angles, might secretly record the ratios of celestial orbits. A midwife's herbal recipe could hide formulas for antiseptics learned from Arabic texts. A merchant's account of tides and shipping routes could contain star tables copied from ancient sources. No soldier or priest would think to question them. They were common people, moving between towns and kingdoms, too humble to draw suspicion. In their simplicity lay the perfect disguise. The Watchers used music, measurement, and commerce as their camouflage. Hymnals, copied by travelling choirs, carried coded annotations. A misplaced note or extra pause in a chant represented numbers. Those numbers translated into data, coordinates, or even entire experiments. When sung aloud, the message became sound, invisible, and untraceable. Midwives, often dismissed by clerics as harmless women, were among the most effective couriers. They travelled freely, tending to births and sickness. Many had been trained by monastic healers before medicine became restricted to church authority. They memorized recipes for remedies that doubled as chemical equations. In whispered tones, they passed this knowledge from one generation to another, claiming it was simply old wisdom. In truth, it was science wrapped in superstition. The stonemasons, meanwhile, carried geometry wherever they went. They built cathedrals, bridges, and fortresses, but their blueprints often contained diagrams far older than the structures themselves. Within the curvature of an arch, or the placement of a column, they encoded proportions drawn from sacred geometry and astronomical alignments. To the untrained eye, it was craftsmanship. To another watcher, it was a message. By the late 14th century, this network stretched across Europe. From the ports of Venice to the highlands of Scotland, knowledge moved faster than any army could stop it. In markets and monasteries, on docks and in vineyards, pieces of the old science were exchanged under the cover of everyday life. The Watchers no longer needed libraries. The people had become the pages. Each song, each recipe, each carving in stone was a line of their hidden text. The church tried to tighten control, but every new restriction only forced the Watchers to grow smarter, quieter, more ordinary. Their genius was to make truth look boring. They turned survival into an art form, transforming the world itself into their secret archive. And as centuries passed, the couriers remained unseen, their messages disguised as hymns and handshakes, keeping alive the flame of a knowledge that refused to die. In the early years of the 16th century, when Europe was beginning to awaken from its long sleep, a new order emerged inside the church. They called themselves the Society of Jesus, but history would remember them as the Jesuits. Outwardly, they were devoted teachers and missionaries. Beneath that devotion, however, lay something older, something that echoed the forgotten work of the Watchers. The Jesuits inherited many of the same tools once hidden in monastic vaults, the lenses, astrolabes, and coded manuscripts that had survived the centuries. But unlike the Watchers, they did not operate in the shadows. Their light was official, sanctioned, and fiercely controlled. Within their colleges, the Jesuits built laboratories that rivaled the lost workshops of the medieval monks. They studied optics, magnetism, and celestial mechanics with the same curiosity that had once been punished as heresy. Yet every discovery passed through a filter of obedience. What was useful to faith became public science. what was not disappeared quietly into the archives of Rome. This became known among them as the mirror, the principle that knowledge must reflect, never challenge, divine order. The Jesuit mirror was both philosophy and method. For every experiment revealed, another was hidden. For every telescope displayed, another instrument was dismantled before it could reveal too much. Within their observatories, Jesuit scholars charted the stars with astonishing precision. Some are said to have predicted eclipses decades in advance, calculations that aligned perfectly with the forgotten sky ladders of the watchers. But such accuracy came at a cost. Their research was reviewed by theologians before publication, ensuring that the heavens still revolved around the proper center, not the sun, but the church. A few among them whispered that this new order had not replaced the watchers but absorbed them. Their secrecy, their discipline, their fascination with blending science and spirituality all seemed too familiar to be coincidence. Some historians later claimed that the Jesuits kept a separate archive known only as the speculum, the mirror vault, containing manuscripts deemed too dangerous for the public eye. There were reports of machines capable of measuring magnetic fields, early sketches of solar engines, and even descriptions of substances that glowed without flame. None of these ever reached print. Instead, they were rephrased as moral lessons or disguised as allegories in theological texts. The Jesuits mastered the art of half-truth, releasing fragments of knowledge just enough to advance human progress, but never enough to lose control. Under their watch, science and faith danced in delicate balance, each reflecting the other like faces in a mirror that showed only what it wished to reveal. The world saw enlightenment, but behind the light, the shadow of the old secrecy remained. The Watchers had once hidden knowledge to protect it from destruction. The Jesuits hid it to protect the power that knowledge could grant. In that mirror, the truth was never destroyed, only carefully refracted, until no one could tell whether they were looking at the real image or its reflection. Across Europe, from the mountains of Spain to the valleys of Poland, there are hundreds of paintings known as Black Madonnas. To most pilgrims, they are images of the Virgin, darkened by smoke or age, revered for their supposed miracles. But hidden within the layers of paint and the strange metallic pigments, the Watchers saw something else. They called it the Black Madonna problem. Why did so many of these icons share the same unusual materials? Why did they contain markings that resembled celestial coordinates rather than decorative flourishes? And why did their locations align with ancient sites of astronomical observation? The first clues appeared in the 15th century, when restorers in France noticed that certain Black Madonna icons were painted with mineral pigments containing iron and manganese, substances that glowed faintly under heat. When the surface was warmed, invisible inscriptions appeared, often circles with intersecting lines and small dots arranged like constellations. Some scholars dismissed these as imperfections. The Watchers did not. They realized that these markings formed star charts accurate for specific nights centuries earlier. The Black Madonnas, it seemed, were maps disguised as devotion. Pilgrimages to these shrines became something far more complex than acts of faith. Along the routes, merchants, monks, and wanderers exchanged coded observations. The Watchers used these gatherings as cover, passing updates about astronomical cycles, climate shifts, and navigation routes under the veil of piety. A pilgrim might kneel before an icon, light a candle, and in that quiet moment, note how the figure's jeweled halo matched the pattern of the Pleiades. Another might whisper a prayer containing numbers instead of words, a cipher that only others in the network could understand. In this way, data travelled invisibly across borders where books could not. Every new icon served as both sanctuary and signal. In the sanctuary of Montserrat, the Black Madonna's pedestal bears tiny engravings of stars that match the summer solstice sky of the year 1284. In Poland's Jasna Góra monastery, the same configuration appears, shifted slightly to record precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. The Watchers were tracking time itself through sacred art. The Church, as always, noticed patterns it could not explain. Some bishops ordered restorations to lighten the figures, claiming that the darkness offended aesthetic norms. Yet, the darker the paint, the more easily it hid the metallic compounds that carried encoded information. Pilgrimage, a movement once fueled by faith, had become a hidden field experiment spanning continents. Through statues and songs, relics and prayers, the Watchers continued their silent study of the heavens. Even centuries later, modern researchers still puzzle over how so many Black Madonnas share astronomical precision in their placement and design. Perhaps faith and science were never at war in those shadowed chapels. Perhaps the Watchers understood that the sacred image was the perfect mask for forbidden truth. In the glow of candlelight, where belief met geometry, the stars themselves were painted into the face of the divine. In the year 1420, Europe was gripped by a terror that no prayer could fully hold back. The plague swept across cities and villages, leaving death in its wake and fear in the hearts of everyone who survived. Amid the chaos, a small group of monks and lay scholars began recording what they observed, quietly noting patterns that no one else dared to see. They kept what became known as the plague ledger. In abbeys and hospitals, they watched that mortality was not uniform. Some houses lost nearly everyone, while others, under subtle care, survived with far fewer deaths. They began cataloguing the differences. Windows opened during the day, allowing wind to circulate through sleeping quarters. Herbs were distilled into fumes and oils, applied to doors, clothing, and patient beds. Meals were delivered with careful attention to distance. Sick individuals were separated from those who showed no signs, a practice that would later be called quarantine. The monks wrote the observations in meticulous detail, often in coded Latin or in symbols hidden within prayer texts. A note about time might stand for antiseptic treatment. A circle drawn in the margin might indicate air circulation. When scribes copied these ledgers for wider distribution, they were warned to disguise the content as devotional instruction or moral counsel. By the end of the plague year, patterns became undeniable. Houses following the coded protocols survived at rates 3 to 4 times higher than those that relied only on prayer. The Watchers noted it all, their excitement tempered by the knowledge that such discoveries could never be openly acknowledged. In the year 1421, the ledger was reviewed by a visiting abbot and a theologian from the capital. They questioned the methods, but did not record them in official annals. When the ledger returned, it vanished from the monastery's shelves. Some say it was destroyed, others believe it was hidden in a secret archive, preserved for those who knew the code. The Church feared that knowledge of these practices might lead people to think disease could be controlled without divine intervention. Yet, through the veil of secrecy, the information survived. Certain families, midwives, and local healers applied the principles learned from the ledger in their own homes. They kept it alive orally, disguised as prayers, songs, and rituals for health. The Watchers had discovered that observation and action could save lives, even when authorities denied the possibility. Their work in the plague ledger was a quiet rebellion against fate itself. It showed that humanity could act with intelligence and foresight, even when told only to submit. The knowledge of quarantine, ventilation, herbal distillation, and careful contact would reappear centuries later in medical manuals, long after the monks who recorded it had passed into memory. And in those forgotten pages, it is clear that Europe had glimpsed a science of survival long before the modern world would claim it as its own. The ledger was gone, but its echoes lived in the lives it quietly saved. In the heart of Europe, beneath soaring arches and within the intricate stonework of Gothic cathedrals, there lies a hidden language. It is not written on parchment, but carved into the very fabric of the building. The Watchers, working with master masons, left behind what they called the stone equation. Every rose window, every labyrinth etched into the floor, Every column and vault carried numbers and ratios that spoke not only of geometry, but of light, sound, and weight. In the year 1315, records describe a cathedral begun in the city of Reims. Its builders were instructed to follow precise ratios, some appearing in the alignment of windows, others in the spacing of arches. To the casual eye, it was artistry, the splendor of faith made visible in stone. To the trained watcher, it was a formula. When sunlight hit the rose window at dawn on the winter solstice, the colors cast patterns that matched harmonic ratios in music. The choir floor echoed with resonance, amplifying specific notes while silencing others. Columns were calculated not only to bear the immense load of stone, but to vibrate subtly with the movement of air, creating a living instrument of physics and devotion. These measurements were passed down orally in guilds, memorized and transmitted from master to apprentice. Written copies existed only in coded sketches, hidden beneath decorative tracery or disguised as floral motifs. The Church, aware of the extraordinary precision, allowed the practice because it enhanced devotion. Yet no one outside the circle of builders could read the true meaning. In Florence, around the year 1320, a similar principle appeared in a monastery library. Diagrams of floor patterns were labelled as decorative, but they mapped ratios of sunlight through cloistered arches, angles that tracked the equinoxes, and points of reflection that illuminated altars with near perfection. The stone equation was everywhere, yet invisible. Some believed it was divine inspiration. The watchers knew it was observation, mathematics, and coded instruction. By the late 14th century, certain masons began teaching initiates how to read a cathedral. A single glance at a labyrinth could reveal proportions of vaults. A rose window could indicate timing for bells. A column sequence could encode the weight distribution of the roof. Every cathedral became a living manuscript, an encyclopedia of light, sound, and structure. Secrets were carefully preserved. When inquisitors demanded records of unusual practices, the explanations given were only partially true. The real calculations were never revealed, carried instead in memory and in stone. Today, researchers still marvel at the precision of Gothic cathedrals, their structural genius often attributed to artistic flair or divine providence. Yet hidden within their proportions, harmonics, and geometry lies a code, a legacy of the watchers and masons who encoded knowledge in stone. For those who can read it, the cathedral is no longer just a place of worship. It is a formula written in granite and glass, a silent testament to the intelligence and foresight of those who understood how to make the very earth and air speak in harmony. In the year 1270, a young lens grinder named Matteo lived in Venice. He crafted glass so clear that it revealed the smallest imperfections in metal and wood. But when he presented his lenses to a visiting scholar, claiming they could magnify distant stars and chart the heavens, the accusation came swiftly: sorcery. By the decree of the local bishop, Matteo was exiled, his workshop destroyed, and his notes burned. Yet the lenses themselves survived, hidden among traders and artisans who understood their true purpose. Decades later, telescopes emerged, celebrated as revolutionary, though their invention had already been attempted in secret generations before. Across the Alps, in a small convent in Bavaria, around the year 1300, a healer named Helene practiced a subtle art of controlling pain. She combined aromatic herbs with careful breathing, guiding patients through surgeries that would otherwise have been fatal. When the surgeons reported her methods to the ecclesiastical authorities, she was accused of witchcraft. Her writings were seized, her tools scattered, and she was forbidden to practice. Centuries later, her techniques resurfaced, credited to anesthetists who claimed discovery in the modern era. Far from land and cloister, on the shipyards of Genoa in the year 1265, a shipwright named Lucio experimented with iron compasses and magnetic bearings to improve navigation. Rumours reached the church that he could guide vessels without prayer or divine intervention. He was tried for heresy, stripped of his position and his bearings confiscated. Yet the principles he developed were quietly copied by sailors who understood their value, only to reappear during the Age of Discovery under new names and credited to others. The pattern repeats across time. The Watchers understood that curiosity, experimentation, and observation were dangerous when wielded without authority. Any innovation that threatened orthodoxy risked destruction. Yet, knowledge has a way of surviving. Each exile, each silence, each public condemnation was a temporary barrier. The innovation itself could not be erased. It travelled hidden in memory, disguised in innocuous work, passed from master to apprentice, from midwife to child, from mason to stonemason. When centuries passed and the grip of strict orthodoxy loosened, the same discoveries re-emerged, appearing as if newly invented, credited to those safe enough to survive the scrutiny of the age. The lens grinder's telescope, the healer's anesthesia, the shipwright's compass, all returned, proving that ideas could not be contained by fear. The Watchers documented these cycles, noting the difference between suppression and disappearance. Knowledge was rarely destroyed. It was buried, concealed, and repurposed. What the Church called heresy was often simply a premature revelation. In secret, the seeds of science and engineering continued to grow, nurtured by those courageous enough to preserve them at great personal risk. And though the names changed, the essence of the innovations endured. The experiment called heresy was not an end, but a passage, a crucible through which human understanding passed before it could safely reappear, stronger and more resilient than before. The stories of Matteo, Helene, and Lucio remind us that discovery is often timeless, even when it must hide for centuries before the world is ready to see it. In the year 1560, the Vatican began what would later be called the Archive's Shadow. Scholars from across Europe requested access to manuscripts, maps, and astronomical logs, but most were denied. Catalogue cards were altered so that certain titles appeared missing, misplaced, or destroyed. Books that existed in reality were listed as lost or forbidden. The archive grew not just in volume, but in secrecy. Every shelf expansion, every addition of private collections, was deliberate. It was not a mistake. Silence became policy. Clerics who worked inside the archive understood that knowledge was power, and controlling access to it was authority itself. Visitors were allowed to see only what had been deemed safe by decades of careful review. Requests for texts containing unusual mathematics, mechanical diagrams, or experimental procedures were quietly set aside, their approval delayed indefinitely. Letters from the year 1589 describe scholars growing frustrated, waiting years for permission that never came. The mechanisms of forgetting were subtle. Some manuscripts were physically moved to vaults so deep within the walls that even clerics rarely ventured there. Others were copied with crucial pages omitted. Marginalia, the secret notes left by generations of watchers, were erased under the pretext of restoration. The archive's librarians were trained not merely to preserve, but to filter. Each document was assessed for doctrinal safety before it could ever see the light of day. Requests that seemed innocuous could be delayed for decades if the material risked revealing knowledge the Church was not ready to release. By the early 17th century, this system was so refined that even those inside rarely understood what was missing. Silence created a vacuum. Scholars assumed absence meant non-existence. Generations grew up thinking that lost texts, abandoned laboratories, and vanished manuscripts were never there. Yet the archive held them, preserved, catalogued, and protected. In the shadows of its shelves, mechanical treatises, celestial charts, anatomical drawings, and chemical formulas waited. Some were centuries old, copied and recopied to survive decay, yet never allowed to influence the broader world. The policy of silence ensured that knowledge travelled only under controlled conditions, often in fragments, encoded in hymns, architectural patterns, or oral traditions. The archive's shadow was not just a physical place, it was a method. Forgetting became an art form, and the absence of information as powerful as its presence. In modern times, researchers have discovered hints of this system. Letters, partial inventories, and references in external correspondence reveal the careful orchestration. What the public knows is only the tip of a vast network designed to manage memory itself. The archive's shadow teaches that control over knowledge is not merely censorship, it is the shaping of collective memory. Information is not lost by accident. It is curated, hidden, and revealed only according to the plan of those in power. And for those who study it closely, the silence speaks as loudly as any text ever could. In the year 1612, scholars began noticing a strange pattern. Copies of manuscripts that had been presumed lost appeared simultaneously in towns that had no known contact with each other. A map that had vanished from Venice was suddenly found in Rouen. A treatise on optics, thought destroyed in Cologne, surfaced in a small abbey near Prague. At first, each discovery seemed unrelated, a lucky survival against the odds. But careful comparison revealed something far more unsettling. Each copy shared the same errors, the same smudged annotations, even the same misnumbered pages. It was as if a single source had been leaking through cracks in a carefully maintained system. The scholars realized that these were not random survivals. They were evidence of a centralized archive whose control was slipping at the edges. The Vatican, the secret repositories of the Watcher's descendants, had failed to contain every copy. Some manuscripts had escaped, intentionally or accidentally, and travelled through indirect channels, scribes moving between monasteries, merchants carrying texts disguised as account books, and priests taking notes home in the dead of night. The errors themselves became a signature, proof that the manuscripts originated from the same protected source. Marginal notes in coded Latin, diagrams hidden beneath illuminated letters, and subtle shifts in terminology pointed to a single mind or collective oversight overseeing the copies. In the year 1620, a Jesuit scholar in Rome wrote to a colleague in Vienna, describing how a botanical manuscript from an Italian monastery contained instructions for herb distillation identical to those in a German abbey's copy, including the same minor mistakes. No trade route connected the two locations. No official correspondence existed. The implication was clear. The Central Archive was bleeding knowledge, intentionally or through negligence. This leak terrified those in power. If knowledge escaped, even in fragments, the carefully curated flow of information could be disrupted. Scholars might discover patterns, see connections that were not meant to be seen, or worse, understand the full scope of what had been preserved. Some clerics argued that the leak must be sealed immediately. Orders were sent to retrieve surviving copies, to restrict access to anyone outside approved circles, and to monitor all manuscript movements. But the leak continued, subtle and persistent. By the mid-17th century, historians noted that some discoveries credited to later inventors or observers were already recorded in these escaped texts. Instruments, experiments, and astronomical observations reappeared with slightly altered names or hidden in allegorical language. The centralized source had lost control without ever revealing itself. The leak proved that even the most secure system could not contain knowledge forever. It showed that the Watcher's methods, the Jesuit archives, and the controlled copies were part of a fragile balance between secrecy and survival. And somewhere in the margins of these manuscripts, the fingerprints of those long-hidden custodians remained, a testament to the impossible task of guarding human understanding against its own relentless desire to be known. In the year 1712, a group of astronomers in Rome and Paris began a careful project. They reconciled star logs from ancient monasteries with records of eclipses noted in Jewish, Greek, and Chinese texts. At first, the work seemed routine. a cross-checking of centuries of observation. But soon, they noticed inconsistencies. Certain eclipses recorded in Europe did not match the positions of the sun and moon according to modern calculations. Some events described in the chronicles could not have occurred on the dates given. When the logs were aligned with the stars, gaps appeared in the timeline. Years seemed to vanish or shift, leaving whole sequences of reigns, battles, and holy events floating in uncertainty. The Watchers' influence became apparent. Their chronology, preserved in secret star tables and observational notebooks, operated independently of the official church calendar. In some cases, feast days were adjusted to match stellar events rather than the date decreed by Rome. The discrepancy was small at first, days or weeks, but over decades and centuries, the drift grew significant. Scholars realized that the calendar itself was a lever, a tool of authority capable of shaping how people perceived history. If the stars told one story and the official calendar another, which could be trusted, the implications were profound. Kings and popes who had ruled based on divine timing might have done so according to a manipulated framework. Events thought to be separated by decades might have overlapped. Generations might have been misled about the length of centuries, about the sequence of rulers, and even about when great discoveries had occurred. Some astronomers who attempted to publish their findings were silenced, accused of challenging sacred history. The Church saw the potential danger immediately. A timeline controlled by the Watchers could undermine centuries of authority. Records were requested, star logs confiscated, and reconciliations halted. Yet the gaps persisted. Copies of Watchers' notes survived in monasteries, in the margins of manuscripts, in instruments that measured celestial positions with precision. In Florence, a partial eclipse recorded in the year 1452 was found to be off by nearly 2 decades, according to official European chronicles. The notes that corrected the dates were hidden in a Jesuit observatory in the year 1710. Scholars who examined the documents quietly spoke of an invisible hand that had shaped history through time itself. The reckoning of time became a dangerous endeavour. It revealed that history was not merely written, but orchestrated, that chronology could be bent as carefully as ink on parchment. And yet, even under pressure, some astronomers persisted. They continued to reconcile logs, map the stars, and compare calendars, understanding that truth in time was essential to understanding truth itself. The Watchers' legacy, hidden for centuries, had resurfaced not in grand monuments or secret experiments, but in the quiet motion of the heavens. Each calculation, each eclipse, each log became a piece of the puzzle, threatening to reshape the official spine of history. And in that revelation, it became clear that time had always been more than a measure of days. It was a tool, a weapon, and a record of human intent. In the year 1650, in the quiet corridors of a forgotten monastery, the last known instructions of the Watchers were sealed behind a heavy stone gate. The candlelight flickered against the walls, illuminating manuscripts, instruments, and diagrams that had not seen eyes outside the cloister for centuries. The Watchers had never sought rebellion. Their goal had been simple and profound: to reduce suffering, to uncover truth, to leave the world a little more illuminated than they found it. Each experiment, each calculation, each coded manuscript was not a weapon, but a lamp. They wanted reproducible mercy, methods to heal, to guide, to understand. A lens that revealed disease in a body, a calculation that predicted the movement of stars, a formula for antiseptic herbs. Each was a gift intended for anyone who could read the code. Yet, to protect the knowledge from destruction, they hid it carefully. Some instruments were dismantled and stored in secret vaults. Manuscripts were rolled and placed in boxes lined with iron. Marginalia that explained critical details were concealed under layers of illustration. Centuries passed, and the world forgot these lamps existed. People believed pain and ignorance were unchangeable. Science and faith seemed to be at odds, when in reality the Watchers had sought to make them allies. The stone gate held more than objects. It held the principles of observation, experimentation, and compassion. Whoever discovered it could unlock not just physical tools, but the very mindset of those who understood the balance of curiosity and reverence. The narrator of this story walks the reader to the threshold of the gate, explaining that knowledge does not vanish merely because it is hidden. It waits, like a slumbering giant, patient and precise. The manuscripts, instruments, and encoded methods are not inert. They are sleeping instructions, capable of teaching a future generation to measure the stars, treat disease, and understand the world in ways long considered impossible. The question, then, is what happens when they awaken? Will humanity be ready to receive the lamp without fear? Will the gate be opened carefully, with respect for the intention behind each hidden formula? Or will the knowledge be misused, turned into spectacle or weapon, rather than a tool for enlightenment and mercy? The narrator leaves the reader with a challenge. Look around at the tools already at our disposal. The data, the experiments, the forgotten notes stored in museums, libraries, and private collections. Consider what slumbering truths may still lie beneath stone and iron, waiting for someone to read, replicate, and understand. The Watchers built the lamp, and they built the gate. The lamp illuminates, but the gate protects. Both are necessary. The future depends not on what is hidden, but on who finds it, who dares to study it, and who carries its light forward with wisdom. For in every shadowed corner of history, the possibility of knowledge waits to awaken, ready to reshape our understanding of suffering, truth, and the very nature of mercy. And perhaps, when the experiments finally awaken, the world will see not chaos, but a carefully measured illumination long intended by those who came before.